In today's video, I'll be going through 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse by verse, and explaining how Paul was responding to the situation in Thessalonica and the teachings of his opponents. If you haven't already, be sure to watch the first video in this series that reconstructs the situation and those teachings. It'll be difficult to understand this video without watching it first. I'll link to the playlist of the entire series in the description below. Alright, starting with chapter 3, verse 1. Therefore, when we could no longer endure it, we thought it best to be left behind, alone at Athens. In light of not being able to visit the Thessalonians personally, Paul let them know he cares by sending someone to check on them. Verse 2. And we sent Timothy, our brother, and God's fellow worker in the gospel of Christ, to strengthen and encourage you for the benefit of your faith. In the framework of Paul's opponents, Timothy, a Gentile, would have been considered one who followed the way of the Spirit, and Paul, a Jew, someone who followed the way of the flesh. These two groups would not have considered each other brothers, but Paul calls Timothy his brother. Someone who followed the way of the Spirit would not have been considered God's fellow worker, but again, Paul refers to Timothy as just that. With God's role established earlier in the sentence, this is the first time that Paul refers to his message as the gospel of Christ instead of the gospel of God. Again, Paul's opponents would have asked, which Christ? The Christ in the Spirit or the Christ in the flesh? But for Paul, there is only one Christ, and that was Jesus. In the framework of Paul's opponents, faith was associated with the inferior way of the Spirit, but Paul tells them that the encouragement sent is for their faith. Verse 3. So that no one would be disturbed by these afflictions, for you yourselves know that we have been destined for this. Where exactly was this affliction coming from? Let's take a look at the group dynamics once again that I talked about in the first video in this series. Those who followed Paul's teachings, aka the way, would have been viewed in a hostile way by both Jews who believed in the two ways and Gentiles who believed in the two ways. This differs from the typical explanation that the afflictions came from Gentiles outside of the church. Once again, Paul addresses the Thessalonians' desire for more knowledge by ironically referencing what they already knew, indicating that they didn't need more knowledge. In contrast to being destined to wrath like Paul's opponents told the Thessalonians, Paul tells them that they are destined to the afflictions caused by those same opponents. Verse 4. For even when we were with you, we kept telling you in advance that we were going to suffer affliction, and so it happened, as you know. Paul's opponents had predicted a grim future for those who followed the way of the Spirit. Paul flexes here by recounting one of his own predictions that came true. Once again, Paul addresses the Thessalonians' desire for more knowledge by ironically referencing what they already know, indicating that they didn't need more knowledge. Verse 5. For this reason, when I could no longer endure it, I also sent to find out about your faith, for fear that the tempter might have tempted you, and our labor would have been for nothing. According to Paul's opponents, faith was part of the inferior way of the Spirit, but Paul indicates its importance by saying that it was one of the main reasons he sent Timothy to them. According to Paul's opponents, it was Satan that tempted Jesus successfully, thereby creating the way of the Spirit, which was inferior to the way of the flesh. But Paul ironically says that he was afraid the tempter had tempted the Thessalonians into the way of the flesh. The Thessalonians were worried that their labor would be for nothing when the day of the Lord came. Paul uses irony by saying that he was worried his labor would be for nothing. Verse 6. But now that Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us good news of your faith and love, and that you always think kindly of us, longing to see us just as we also long to see you. Paul uses irony again when instead of referring to his own gospel message, he refers to the news of the faith and love of the Thessalonians as good news, aka gospel. Paul's opponents wanted the Thessalonians to abandon their faith and follow the way of the flesh. Their teachings caused hostilities among those in the church. It's in light of this that Paul says he's glad to hear the faith and love of those who remained faithful to the way. Paul again reassures the Thessalonians that he cares about them. Verse 7. For this reason, brothers, in all our distress and affliction, we were comforted about you through your faith. Paul once again uses the term brothers, not only to show he cares about them, but that they are of the same group. Once again, Paul reassures the Thessalonians that they should have faith and not follow the way of the flesh by saying that he is comforted by their faith. Verse 8. For now we live if you stand firm in the Lord. Paul's opponents believed that if the Thessalonians wanted to live through the day of the Lord, they needed to follow the way of the flesh. Paul uses irony by shifting from the future day of the Lord to the present time of the Thessalonians. It is now that they live if they stand firm in the Lord. And again, the phrase the Lord referred to the coming Christ. Paul's opponents believed that this was the Christ in the flesh, but Paul believed it was Jesus. Verse 9. For what thanks can we give to God for you in return for all the joy with which we rejoice because of you before our God? Paul once again breaks the framework of his opponents by reassuring the Thessalonians of their good standing before God. Verse 10. As we keep praying most earnestly night and day, that we may see your faces and may complete what is lacking in your faith. Paul's opponents believed that those who followed the way of the flesh should pray during the day, and those who followed the way of the Spirit should pray at night. Paul responds to this by saying he prays night and day. Paul once again tells the Thessalonians that he wants to see them, indicating that he cares about them. Paul wasn't worried what the Thessalonians were lacking in their knowledge, but rather what was lacking in their faith. Paul continually reassures them that it is right to have faith and that they don't need to follow the way of the flesh. Verse 11. Now may our God and Father himself and our Lord Jesus direct our way to you. Paul once again breaks the false dichotomy of his opponents by bringing God and Jesus together in one way. Paul once again lets the Thessalonians know that Jesus is not just their Lord, but he is Paul's Lord as well. And Paul once again reassures the Thessalonians that he does want to see them. Verse 12. And may the Lord cause you to increase and overflow in love for one another and for all people, just as we also do for you. By using the phrase the Lord, Paul is referring to the coming Christ. The teachings of Paul's opponents about the coming Christ was causing hostility among the Thessalonians. But Paul uses irony and says, may the Lord bring love for each other. And that goes for all within the church. Paul is reacting against the hostility that was caused by his opponents. And Paul once again reassures them that he cares for them, contrary to his opponents who claimed he didn't because he followed the way of the flesh. Verse 13. So that he may establish your hearts blameless in holiness before our God and Father at the coming of our Lord Jesus with all his saints. Paul reassures the Thessalonians they didn't have to follow the way of the flesh to obtain holiness. Paul once again breaks the false dichotomy of his opponents by bringing God and Jesus together in one way. It was Jesus who is the Christ in the flesh that is to come, not another Christ like his opponents taught. And Paul once again says that Jesus is his Lord too, not just the Lord of the Gentiles. With all his saints, or holy ones, by using the word all, Paul is including both Gentile believers and Jewish believers. This is countering the idea that only those who follow the way of the flesh will be those who are with the coming Christ. That's the end of chapter 3. In my next video, I'll go through chapter 4, verse by verse. Thanks for watching, and please like, share, and subscribe.